Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. But you know what? We're going to make this video informative also, because I had a subscriber ask me this morning, I answered a little bit ago, he said, I don't understand what you mean. How can you say something like the deadlift, the conventional deadlift, works the traps more than a rack pull? The rack pull uses more weight. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And you know, this is funny because we now have multiple big YouTubers who are talking about rack pulls for traps. And guys, I've dissected this from a partials perspective before. I'm not even going to cover that again. We don't need to actually cover the partial end of it, right? Because we know that partials with a heavier weight based upon study after study after study produce less strength and less muscle growth, right? That's not even a point of debate anymore. The evidence is overwhelmingly one-sided there. The problem we have here is that people are talking about isometrics and everything else, and they're talking about weight, and they actually think that in the case of some of these isometric movements, which is what we're talking about, because traps are only worked isometrically on a deadlift or rack pull, any of that. That's why deadlifts are not really the best trap movement out there, right? They're not really the best trap movement out there. I can think of right now, I can name 3 exercises that will give you bigger traps than a 500 or 600 pound deadlift will. You guys ready? Shrugs, especially big power shrugs, standing overhead presses, and rows, any type of row. Right? Barbell, dumbbell, hell, cable rows. I'm a barbell guy. I'm going to admit, you could probably build bigger traps with cable rows than you can with deadlifts, or rack pulls for that matter, right? Anyone going to disagree with that biomechanically? Because people are forgetting, when they're thinking of traps, they're only thinking of this little bit up here, right? This little bit of muscle up here. Your trap runs all the way down your back. It runs to the base of your rib cage. And you guys know, due to radiant effect and everything else, that when you stimulate one part of a muscle, you do stimulate the other parts of the muscle to a lesser extent. You will grow the whole muscle by stimulating it, right? Any exercise that works a muscle will cause the entire muscle to grow. Just some parts of it might grow more than others. But, you know, let's think about the weight thing here for a moment. Most of you understand that weight isn't everything when you're talking about completely different movements, right? If you work a muscle in a completely different way, particularly on a compound movement, equal weight doesn't always mean the same growth, right? And here's what I mean. If you build your deadlift up to 500 pounds for 5 reps, and that was the only exercise you did for your traps, most of you realize that if you did barbell rows from the floor, like a pen lay row with 300 pounds for 5 reps, and that's what you built up to, who's going to have bigger traps? The 300 pound row. Because in terms of overall back strength, and that includes your upper back, that is stronger, right? That's stronger in regards to those muscles. More work is being done there. A lot more work with a 300 pound row than a 500 pound conventional deadlift. Is anyone going to debate that? Majority of 500 pound deadlifters can't row 300 pounds. In fact, most 500 pound deadlifters probably aren't rowing much more than about 225, 230 off the floor for strict pen lays, right? They're probably not doing much more than that. That's pretty standard. There are exceptions. You might be the exception. There are also guys who are weaker. I know guys who can't row 200 with strict form off the floor who can deadlift 500. They're there. But we understand that, right? That's not a point of contention. So when you've got all these guys who are talking about, oh, doing these for traps, well, it's like, guys, it's an isometric movement. And you need to realize traps do more than one thing. They don't just shrug up, because that's all the people are worried about. They're worried about that stretch, right? Holding it down. You don't realize they also pull your scapula back. In fact, possibly more muscle is used in the traps pulling the scapula back than by shrugging. Arguably, we could debate that. They're both important. If you really wanted to maximize the size of the muscle, those are both probably important movements. I don't think anyone's going to debate that point. But, well, they might. But stop and think about what's going on there. People, you have to understand, when you're just talking about a stretch at the top, an isometric stretch, I don't care whether it's a deadlift, a rack pull, a farmer's walk, you do know your traps can't go lower, right? Meaning Probably 300 pounds, 400 pounds on the bar is going to pull even a very strong man's traps into as deep of a stretch as they can possibly go. By adding more weight, you're not stretching them any further at the top. All right, and people don't seem to grasp that here. When you're dealing with isometrics that put a muscle to its joint limitations, when you are stretching a muscle as far as your structure will allow it to stretch to, right? Stretching it as far as it will stretch it to, adding more weight beyond that, the muscle doesn't do any more work. It doesn't cause more stimulation, just like on your biceps, right? Your biceps are stretched all the way down at the bottom of a deadlift. Do you think that going from 300 pounds of stretching it at the bottom to a 500 pounds is going to suddenly make your biceps grow more? You know, why aren't guys who are rack pulling 800 pounds walking around with 20-inch biceps? Because there's only so much stretch overload that a joint or your structure will allow a muscle to be subjected to. Maximum stretch is maximum stretch. If other muscles are involved, they're what's going to take the extra load. In other words, when you're talking about adding more weight on that, your traps aren't working harder because they're starting, look at the way everyone does rack pulls. They're starting with their shoulders down already, right? No one is rack pulling all the way back in scapular retraction. Why? Because you can't hold it. You can't. They just automatically come down before you even break it off the ground. Before you can break that weight off the pins, your trap's stretched down. And these guys are all starting completely upright. They're starting completely upright. Watch any of these guys do these little short range of motion rack pulls. They are all starting upright and squatting the weight up. There's no hip hinge involved. There is no forward lean of the torso involved. In other words, there is nothing going on with scapular retraction to where you're isometrically holding against that. I want to make this clear. Isometrics are not the best way to induce hypertrophy. They can cause growth, but they're not going to ever stimulate maximum growth. Because that's just not how it works. You need dynamic movement. You need a muscle to actually move in order to stimulate it maximally. I mean, isometrics can stimulate some growth. We're not arguing that. But they don't stimulate maximum growth. They don't have the potential to. The muscle fibers aren't there at any given range of motion. You can't recruit every muscle fiber in a muscle through a very short range of motion. You just can't. They're not available. The motor units aren't. So this is what we're dealing with here. But when you think about it, when you're just at the top, if you did a rack pull for 3 inches, 4 inches, whatever, 1 inch, if you pulled 500 pounds versus 800 pounds, your traps are not being stretched any further. They're not doing any more work. What's doing the work? Well, since they're squatting it up, their hips, their upper quads, their core, that's the stuff that's working harder. All of that is working harder when you add weight to the bar, right? It's just a hip exercise. It's a hip and core exercise is what they're doing. It's just putting an isometric stretch at the top. But you're starting upright already with your scapula already, because before you break it off the floor, it pulls you down already. No one is getting the bar an inch off the pins with 800 pounds, especially these smaller guys. No one's breaking it off the pins with 800 pounds without their traps already being stretched completely before the movement. You're not getting any more work there by adding more weight. You can't stretch it any further. It's like your biceps aren't getting worked any further because they're already locked out. Before you can even break it off there, you can't break it off the pins until everything is stretched down because it's too heavy for you to shrug or to hold isometrically up. On a deadlift, a 500-pound deadlift will work your traps more than either a 500 or an 800-pound rack pull, because the 500 and the 800 give the exact same trap stimulation because the traps aren't doing any more work. They're already being held at their maximum limit under a heavy load as far as the stretch goes. It's not stretching further. But on the deadlift, you're starting bent over with your scapula back. All right, you can be pulled from there. In other words, your traps are having to work to keep your scapula, and just like your lats are, they're both working to keep your scapula retracted when you break the weight off the floor until your torso is more upright, and then the load is reduced on those muscles. So hopefully this makes sense and people understand what I'm saying. Just visualize it again. Think about the isometrics involved and what happens with the scapula, the traps, the lats, everything. Your upper back is working harder when you're having to have your shoulders pulled back correctly when you deadlift all the way off of the floor due to the torso angle and then the hip hinge involved. And the further you get upright, the less work they are doing. They're doing less work for every degree of upward angle that you bring up. So if you're already just starting at the top already with your scapula down and your torso upright and just kind of squatting it up a few inches, you're actually working your traps less, and particularly all the middle and lower trap is all being worked less than it is off the floor with the same weight. And even if you go heavier, it doesn't matter because there's no additional movement. Those muscles aren't doing any more work at that point. Your frame, your ligaments, your structure, and your core are what is holding all of that into position at that point. So if you add weight on these rack pulls, your hips are working harder, your abs are working harder, some of your erectors are working harder, your obliques are working harder. Your upper back isn't working any harder the more weight you add once it's already put into a challenging stretch position. So this whole idea is complete and utter nonsense. And anyone spouting it clearly doesn't know anything about the human body. And that's just a fact. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.